All right, we're going to take a look at the beginning of the Cold War, and this time around, we're going to examine Czechoslovakia, Berlin, Korea, and the various alliances that were developed that will eventually destroy the alliance that came about from the Second World War. Okay? The first thing we're going to examine is going to be a documented responses on these two political cartoons. So go ahead and spend a moment and evaluate both and be able to tell me from each point of view what the cartoons are saying and how it may also result in action using some of the key terms that are provided. So pause the video there and go and answer this prompt. All right, once you have that done, we're going to go ahead and sort of review what we have here. And particularly, we start off with the Marshall Plan. Okay? The Marshall Plan itself, which we reviewed in the previous assignment, did a number of things. So be able to answer these questions here before we begin. From the American and German viewpoint, how did they see what they were doing with the Marshall Plan? And then on the other hand, be able to examine the Soviet point of view as well. Again, use some of these images and the political cartoons to remind yourself that you have a singular event, but seen very differently on both sides. So with that, we're going to set up the context here for today and some of the background that will allow us to be able to talk about some of these flashpoints in the 1940s after the Second World War. And what you should be able to do is be able to answer the questions that are provided. The lecture questions are in blue, the document questions are in yellow, and the video questions are in purple. So let's start off with this first lecture question, the political context of Czechoslovakia after the Second World War. So be able to answer this question in the next few minutes. Okay. The first of which is we want to review a little bit the existence of these quote, spheres of influence, where both the Soviet Union and the United States, in occupying Europe after the defeat of Nazi Germany, are going to try to determine the outcomes of what happens in the places that they occupy. But not only that, but the mutual distrust that both of them had on each other. So we looked at the documents from both Kennan and Novikov and how they viewed the Soviet Union and the United States, and the distrust that comes about by thinking that global communism is going to spread from the Soviet Union and destroy capitalism, and or the United States capitalism trying to take over the world. Again, this is what each other are seeing as of one another. Not only that, but we see this in the first incident in regards to the Greek Civil War, where the United States particularly provided resources and benefits for anti-communist forces in both Greece and also in Turkey as well, leading to what is known as the Truman Doctrine of U.S. aid to those who are going to resist communism. And not only that, but the containment policies of the United States, that everywhere else in the world, they want to ensure that communism is contained where it is, that it does not spread elsewhere. Okay. And we also see this in the Marshall Plan, the U.S. financial aid program for rebuilding Europe for these various war-torn countries. Okay. And if you look at this particular map here in regards to where the Marshall Plan was implemented and the amount of money that was given. Now, the United States basically said, look, if you want money to rebuild, all you have to do is apply. And if you're actually looking at this map a little bit closer, you're going to see that a number of countries, particularly the places where the Soviet Union have occupied, they did not bother applying. There's enough pressure from the Soviet Union to say, we'll take care of you, implement the Soviet communist policy, and we will take care of things. Two countries, however, attempted to apply, Poland and Czechoslovakia, where there was debate over, look, should we take this? Should we not? So we're going to key in on Czechoslovakia in the next few minutes here. Because in a lot of ways, it was the country where it all began, the conflict of where it all began. Remember Germany's eventual seizure of Austria, and from there, bordering Czechoslovakia and demanding that the German Sudetens end up being annexed by Germany, leading to the Munich Conference and the eventual annexation of all of the western half of Czechoslovakia and the independence of Slovakia in the east as well. But at the end of the Second World War, the map looks like this. Regions that were mostly occupied by the Soviet Union, but partially by the Western allies as well. And so with that in mind here, Okay? One thing to keep note, not just in Czechoslovakia, but everywhere else in Europe, there is a real case for communism. Remember, before the Second World War, the world was in a Great Depression, right? It looks like capitalism did not work, and that financial and economic crisis led to eventually the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany, leading to the Second World War. So there's a real case by many in Europe to say maybe communism is the right answer to how to rebuild a much better society. And that leads to our discussion on what becomes known as the Czechoslovakian coup and the Berlin blockade, which we're going to take a look at in a moment. Now, in Czechoslovakia, we have to go all the way back to, again, the promise of elections by the Big Three at the Yalta Conference. And while this may not necessarily be true for many of the states that were closer to the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia did attempt to reestablish the democracy that they had in the pre war period. But it was also flavored and colored by a history of resentment towards the West. So it's not as if they're going to say we are democratic or we're going to align ourselves with the United States. No, instead, in Czechoslovakia, there is a real strong memory of the Munich Agreement and particularly the betrayal by the British and French in one, not allowing the Czechoslovakians to be involved in the process at all. And so the agreement to give up the Sudetenland to Hitler and the Germans was done by Prime Minister Chamberlain and Britain and others without their consent. So they feel as if they were betrayed by the Western allies. Not only that, but as the Western allies are growing closer to Germany, particularly, because they felt like they needed a strong Germany to be able to prevent the Soviet Union from taking all of Europe. The mostly Slavic Czechs, or excuse me, the Czechs who are anti-German and the Slavics of Slovakia in the east, they're going to see themselves as closer, having closer ties to the Soviet Union, who are ethnically Slavic, than any other parts in Europe. And so, again, with their pro-Slavic identity, the anti-German sentiment that exists for the Czechs, they're going to say, look, if we have closer ties to the Soviet Union, then so be it. So again, here's this democratic state with close ties to the Soviet Union, and again, the notion that democracy can function with some socialist ideals. And so we see this in the 1946 elections, real elections that take place, competitive elections, where the communists, they don't get a majority, but they are the most powerful political party. So they're obtaining 30, 40, in some cases 50% of the votes in the various regions of Czechoslovakia. And so the Communist Party becomes a vital and key party in Czechoslovakian politics in the 1940s. However, hey, again, there is this aim, particularly this group called the National Front. So a coalition of basically anti-communist governments. So it's not one political party, but multiple political parties, all with different agendas. And what they're trying to do is trying to keep that Western style of democracy, all the while trying to implement socialist style economic policies. But the question is, can they actually coexist? Can you have a very strong communist party with this sort of coalition party that really don't agree with one another to govern Czechoslovakia? And the question is made more difficult because of constant Soviet pressure, and particularly of pro-communist forces, which are going to attempt to try to seize power with support of Stalin, and not only that, but the Red Army, which is right on its border as well. And so what you're going to take a look at in document number 24 is the pressure that is brought about by both the Soviet Union and the communists within Czechoslovakia to, in a lot of ways, influence the government to gain more power within the Czechoslovakian government. And we're going to see the outcomes that comes about from this. So what you're going to do, go ahead and pause the video right now. Spend a few minutes, generally between 7 or 8 minutes, to go ahead and answer the questions for document number 24. So go ahead and do that right now. All right, you should at this point, hey, have completed document number 24. Okay, the next portion is, and where this gonna is really gonna show itself to intensify the conflict is what happens with the city of Berlin. Okay, but let me provide the backdrop for this. Okay, after the Second World War, okay, Nazi German currency becomes completely useless, and so for the several years after this, if Germans wanted to rebuild, or they even want to feed themselves, or work in a particular job, whatever it might be, it would be difficult to actually make exchanges because the currency that they've utilized is completely useless. And so in Germany, whereby you have several occupying forces, someone needs to make a decision in regards to how Germans can actually make exchanges. Without currency, the economy comes to a halt. And so because of the lack of cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States and the other Western powers, the Western powers came together in London to create what is known as the London Program, a secret meeting of many of these top officials that will basically say, look, the Soviet Union isn't responding. They're not cooperating. We need to get things moving. If we want to implement the Marshall Plan, then we need currency in Germany. And so they decided enough is enough. In the zones that we occupy in the West, we're going to create a separate West German government. And not only that, but a separate currency as well. So now the West will officially operate differently than the East. This is really the starting point of the division of Germany. So you could blame whoever you would like, but the Western allies felt like it was the time to move on. Okay? And so, in the context of both the London program, where it seems like the Western allies are going their own way, the United States is pushing for a strong Germany, and they're going to go without the Eastern part if they had to, add to the notion of the American Marshall Plan and the stress and the strain that's going to put on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, plus also the American support of the Greek Civil War. So all of these things provide the context of the Soviet response in Berlin in what becomes known as the Berlin blockade and the subsequent airlift. Okay, so what you're going to do is to go ahead and in the link, go ahead and start watching the first about 15 minutes of the video. Okay, and you're going to go ahead and answer the video questions that are provided. So go ahead, click on the link, start the video, and again, stop at around the 15-minute mark when they show the map of Germany. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay, you should be right at the part where the Berlin has been cut off. Okay. And now's the part to go ahead and take a look at document number 25 and 26, answer the questions that are provided to get a better sense of the logic of the Berlin blockade. All right, you should have spent about 8 minutes on this. Okay? And with that, hey, we're going to take a look at the rest of the Berlin airlift, what it took to be able to do it, to be able to feed, to clothe, and to rebuild, and to keep Germans warm during during the cold winters, all through an airlift. Again, just to remind you that this has never been successfully done before. In World War II, there were attempts to feed entire armies through an airlift, and it just did not work. So let's see how the United States, Britain, and their allies were able to pull this off. All right, you should have completed the video at this point here, okay, but what you should be able to see from the Berlin blockade was the successful airlift, bringing in 2 million tons of goods by air, okay, and it was successful enough in the end such that the Soviet Union had to lift the blockade. Okay. But once we get to these points here, there is a real divide between the United States and the Soviet Union, not just in terms of what's going on in Europe, but other parts of the globe as well. Okay? And that includes what happens in Korea, okay, which after the Second World War. So if you remember, Korea itself was occupied by the Japanese as a Japanese colony. And so, what we're going to take a look at is some real similarities between what we see in Korea and also in Germany as well. So, let's go ahead and provide some background for this here. And so, Korea was divided up into different occupation zones. And the United States had um, occupied the southern portion. The Soviet Union, which had actually invaded northern China to try to defeat the Japanese, and in doing so, ended up occupying a large part of the Korean peninsula as well. And so they're going to start to put their man a man by the name of Kim Il-sung, who had actually fought with some of the Korean insurgents in the north and had worked closely with the Soviet Union as well. And so Kim Il-sung becomes the leading member of the communists in North Korea. Whereas in the South, the United States selected a man by the name of Syngman Rhee, both of which are going to try to enact their vision of trying to create a unified Korea. However, as the communists start to seize power in the north, there was massive migration of people who wanted to move to the south, to move away from the communist regime. And many of these people who came with these people happened to be actually communist insurgents who actually wanted to unify the North and the South um, to become communist. Eventually, Kim Il sung is going to convince Joseph Stalin that the time was ripe to unify the Korean peninsula under the communist banner. And so, with their support, they end up invading the South. And in doing so was able to push the South Korean forces, both police forces, armed forces, and also some Americans as well, into a defense perimeter in the southeastern portion of Korea, where it looked like the communists would actually prevail. However, there was a subsequent UN invasion that will eventually cut off the communist forces and push them way back into North Korea. But as these forces were getting closer and closer to China, China ends up invading uh, North Korea, and they're going to end up fighting the United States in a long, drawn out war for 3 years. And so in this, you have a stalemate that is going to last for a little while, but really for the first time, a massive conflict that is going to include the United States, somewhat the Soviet Union, and communist China at this point in a drawn out conflict, which many will say is the first hot phase of the Cold War, where you actually have combat between both sides. So at this point, go ahead and take a look at, and you should have answered from that part there, political context of Korea after the Second World War, and be able to answer and read document number 28. So go and pause the video and answer those questions right now. All right, coming back. Hey, the threat of possible military conflict between both sides, it's going to lead to a number of defense alliances. And so, what the United States is going to generate with the possibility of and seeing what the Soviet Union could do from the Berlin blockade, they felt as if the threat was strong enough to create a defense alliance in the West that also included West Germany as well. And so, this group will become known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949. Okay. Um, and subsequently, as a response to this, the Soviet Union is going to create the Warsaw Pact. So what we're going to take a look at and what you're going to examine is both of these documents and these alliances rationalized by a series of documents, document number 29 and document number 30. So go ahead and read this and answer the questions for this particular set. And doing so, what you should remind yourself of is the key question that we're going to answer. Again, who's responsible for starting the Cold War? The United States or the Soviet Union? Were they responsible for increasing tensions and breaking up the friendship and alliance that came out of the Second World War? All right, so complete this set, and we're going to go ahead and start the essay process soon.